Most people think the buy, borrow, die strategy is only for billionaires. People like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison. And honestly, that's what the financial media wants you to think. But here's the truth. There's a specific number, a real concrete dollar amount, that opens the door to this strategy for regular people. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what that number is, how to get there, and what to do once you do. So leave a like and let's start. The buy, borrow, die strategy is probably the most powerful legal tax strategy that exists in the United States right now. It's been used for decades by the wealthiest people in the world to build massive amounts of money, pay almost zero in taxes, and pass everything on to their kids, again tax-free. And while most financial content out there explains what the strategy is, almost nobody tells you the part that actually matters. What's the minimum you need to make it work? That's exactly what we'll see later, because now we need to have more context before the amount. Here's the problem most people run into. They hear about this strategy, they get excited, they do a little research, and then they hit a wall. Either the information is way too complicated and full of legal jargon, or they walk away thinking you need to already be a millionaire to use it. So they do nothing. They keep working their job, paying taxes on every dollar they earn, and the gap between them and the wealthy just keeps growing. And the frustrating part, the tax code is not actually hiding this stuff. It's public. It's been public for years. The IRS doesn't care if you use these strategies because they're perfectly legal. The system is literally designed this way. It's just that nobody teaches regular people how to access it. Let me explain what I mean with a simple comparison. If you earn $100,000 at a job this year, you're probably going to pay somewhere between $22,000 and $30,000 in federal and state taxes depending on where you live. That money is just gone. You never see it again. Now imagine instead that you borrowed $100,000 against an asset you own, a property, a portfolio, a business. You get the same $100,000 in your bank account. You pay zero tax on it. Zero. Because borrowed money is not income. You owe it back, so the IRS doesn't count it as yours. That right there is the core of what wealthy people do every single day. And the question isn't whether it works. It works. The question is, how do you get to a place where you can actually do this yourself? Let's break this down properly. The strategy has three parts and they build on each other. Part 1. The first thing you need to do is buy an appreciating asset, something that goes up in value over time and that a lender will accept as collateral. The most common examples are real estate, a stock or investment portfolio, and certain life insurance policies with cash value built in. Now here's why this matters so much. When you own an asset that goes up in value, you don't owe any tax on that growth until you sell. This is called unrealized appreciation. If you bought a property for $200,000 and it's now worth $350,000, you have $150,000 in unrealized gains. You owe zero tax on that right now, not until you sell. This is completely different from a paycheck or a bonus, where the government takes their cut the moment you receive the money. So the buy phase is about building up assets that grow in value. The bigger and more valuable those assets become, the more powerful the next step gets. Oh, and by the way, the most valuable free asset in 2026 is opening a YouTube channel, even from zero, since YouTube is the golden opportunity of this decade. And if you want to understand how to do it, I can help you in my free community in the link below. Part 2. Borrow. Once you have an asset with meaningful value, you can borrow against it. This is called a secured loan, and it comes in several forms depending on what kind of asset you own. If you own real estate, you can take out a home equity line of credit, commonly called a HELOC, or a cash-out refinance. If you have an investment portfolio with stocks, ETFs, or index funds, your brokerage may offer what's called a portfolio line of credit, or a securities-backed line of credit, sometimes called an SBL. If you have a whole life or indexed universal life insurance policy with enough cash value built up, you can borrow directly from the policy. The money you borrow through any of these methods is not taxable. It goes into your bank account. You can spend it on whatever you want, living expenses, buying more assets, starting a business, and you owe zero income tax on it. The loan itself needs to be paid back with interest, which is the cost of using this strategy. But here's the thing. If the asset you borrowed against is continuing to grow in value, you're essentially using someone else's money while your own wealth keeps increasing. And in many cases, the interest on loans used for investment purposes is tax deductible, which makes the cost even lower. This is how wealthy people pay for their lifestyle without taking salary. Instead of pulling money out of a business and paying 37% in federal income tax on it, they borrow against the business or their portfolio and pay zero tax on the cash they receive. Part 3. This is the part that most people find the most surprising. And it's also the part that makes the whole strategy almost impossibly good from a tax perspective. When you pass away, there's a rule in the US tax code called a step up in basis. Here's how it works. Let's say you bought a property 30 years ago for $100,000. Today it's worth $900,000. If you sold it yourself, you'd owe capital gains tax on that $800,000 in growth. At the current long-term capital gains rate, that could easily be $120,000 to $190,000 in tax, depending on your income. But if you hold on to that property until you die and leave it to your kids, the IRS essentially hits a reset button. Your heirs inherit the property at its current market value, $900,000, not what you originally paid for it. If they turn around and sell it the next day for $900,000, they owe zero tax. The entire $800,000 in gains you built up over 30 years just transferred to your family completely tax-free. That is an extraordinary thing. And it's not a loophole or a trick, it's federal law. It's been in the tax code for decades. There are 2 other ways to pass assets to heirs in a tax-efficient way as well. The first is through a 1031 exchange, which allows real estate investors to sell a property and roll the proceeds into a new property without paying capital gains tax at the time of sale. You can keep doing this indefinitely, essentially deferring taxes forever. The second is through a trust where assets can be held and grown inside a legal structure that protects them and passes them to heirs with significant tax advantages. Now let's talk about the part you actually came here for. What is the minimum amount you need to start using this strategy? The honest answer depends on which version of the strategy you're using. Let's go through each one. For a real estate-backed loan, HELOC or cash-out refi. To access a HELOC, most lenders require you to have at least 15% to 20% equity in your home after the loan. So if your home is worth $300,000 and you owe $200,000, you have $100,000 in equity, which is about 33%. That's enough. Most HELOCs will let you access up to 80% to 85% of your home's appraised value minus what you owe. So in that example, $300,000 times 0.80 equals $240,000. Subtract your $200,000 mortgage, and you could borrow up to $40,000 through a HELOC. That means if you own a home and have at least 15 to 20% equity in it, you can already start using a version of this strategy. You don't need to be a millionaire. You just need to own a home and have built up some equity in it. For a securities-backed line of credit, investment portfolio, this is where the numbers get really interesting for people who don't own real estate. Most major brokerages, Fidelity, Schwab, Merrill Lynch, Interactive Brokers, offer securities-backed loans to clients, but they don't all advertise it openly. The minimum portfolio size to access these loans varies. At some brokerages, you can start as low as $100,000 in your taxable investment account. Others require $250,000 or more. The loan-to-value ratio is typically 50% to 70%, meaning if you have $100,000 in a portfolio, you can usually borrow $50,000 to $70,000 against it. There are risks here worth understanding. If the value of your portfolio drops significantly, the lender may issue a margin call, meaning they want you to either put in more money or they'll sell your investments to cover the loan. This is why these loans work best in diversified, relatively stable portfolios, like index funds, rather than individual stocks that can swing wildly. So the realistic entry point for a securities-backed loan is somewhere around $100,000 to $150,000 in a taxable brokerage account. That's achievable. It's not fast for everyone, but it's a real, reachable number. For a cash value life insurance policy loan, this one takes the most time to set up because whole life or indexed universal life insurance policies take several years to build up meaningful cash value. But once they do, you can borrow against that value at very competitive rates. sometimes 5% or lower, and the loan never shows up on your credit report. The minimum to make this work in a meaningful way is typically a cash value of $50,000 or more inside the policy. Depending on the policy structure and how long you've been paying into it, this might take 5 to 10 years to build. But some high-income earners who fund their policies aggressively can get there faster. This strategy tends to make the most sense for people who are already maxing out their 401k and Roth IRA and are looking for additional tax-advantaged options, the absolute minimum to start. If you're starting completely from scratch and have none of these assets yet, the most accessible entry point is real estate. A house with 20% equity in almost any market gives you the ability to begin accessing your wealth without selling it. In many parts of the country, that could mean a home worth as little as $150,000 to $200,000 with a reasonable amount of equity built up. If you're renting and don't own property, then the next most accessible path is building a taxable investment account, contributing consistently to index funds in a regular brokerage account, not just your 401k, and getting to that $100,000 to $150,000 mark opens the door to securities-backed loans. So the real minimum answer? Somewhere between $40,000 in home equity and $100,000 in a taxable investment account. That's the zone where this strategy starts to become usable for regular people. And to get there faster, remember that YouTube, it's blowing up every small channel that does things right, as I teach you in my free community with the link below. Here's the thing that most people miss entirely when they hear about this strategy. It's not just about avoiding taxes right now. It's about what happens over 20, 30, 40 years when you stop selling assets and start borrowing against them instead. Let me give you a real example with actual numbers. Let's say you invest $150,000 into a diversified stock portfolio at age 35. You don't touch it. It grows at an average of 8% per year, which is roughly in line with the long-term historical average of the S&P 500. By the time you're 65, that $150,000 has grown to approximately $1.5 million. If you had been selling pieces of that portfolio along the way to fund your life, you would have paid capital gains taxes each time, 15% or 20% depending on your income, and you would have stopped that money from compounding. But instead you borrowed against it along the way. You paid interest on the loans, sure, but the underlying portfolio kept growing. And at 65, you have $1.5 million that your heirs can inherit essentially tax-free, thanks to the step-up in basis. The difference in outcome between someone who sells assets over their lifetime versus someone who borrows against them can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions, in wealth that gets preserved instead of handed over to the government. This is not a strategy for greedy people. This is a strategy for anyone who wants to keep more of what they build and pass it on to the people they care about. So let's bring this all together. The buy, borrow, die strategy works in 3 steps. You buy appreciating assets, real estate, stocks, a cash value life insurance policy. You borrow against those assets using tax-free loans to fund your lifestyle instead of selling things and triggering a tax bill. And when you pass away, your heirs receive those assets with a stepped-up cost basis, meaning decades of gains can transfer completely tax-free. The minimum you need to start is not as high as most people think. If you own a home with at least 15 to 20% equity, you can open a HELOC and start using a version of this right now. If you have $100,000 to $150,000 in a taxable investment account, most major brokerages will offer you a securities-backed loan. If you're earlier in your journey, the goal is simply to start building those assets, consistently, patiently, without rushing. The wealthy don't have access to some secret system that's hidden from you. They just understand how the existing tax code works, and they build their lives around it. You can do the same thing. It requires patience, the right assets, and a willingness to think long-term instead of reacting to short-term needs. Watch the next video to learn exactly how to build your first borrowable asset from scratch. Just a reminder,